in the darkened corridors of Spain's royal palaces, where candlelight flickered against blood-stained tapestries and secrets whispered through the stone. There lived a king whose name would rot in the annals of time. Ferdinand VII, a monarch not of glory, but of gluttony. A ruler not crowned in honor, but soaked in scandal, cruelty, and carnal depravity so foul it was hidden even from the Church's most forgiving confessions. This is not the story of a man. It is the slow, agonizing autopsy of a soul long since devoured by power, lust, and madness. And what you are about to hear may forever alter the way you look at history's thrones. In the year of our Lord 1784, amidst the polished marble halls of El Escorial, under the somber eyes of ancestral portraits and crucifixes heavy with dust, a boy was born. He was not hailed with joy, but with a silence too sharp for celebration. His name was Ferdinand, heir to the Spanish Bourbon throne, and 2 centuries of blood, betrayal, and sacred rot. To the world, he was a prince, but to fate, he was a vessel, fragile, cracked, and destined to overflow. From the very beginning, the signs were there. The infant wailed, not with hunger, but as if tormented by ghosts only he could see. His mother, Maria Luisa of Parma, regarded him with cold detachment, her affections tangled in other, more illicit beds. His father, Charles IV, a dull and pliant monarch, offered no warmth, only the sterile air of formality. In the great palace, with its long, echoing corridors and thick tapestries that seemed to watch and whisper, Ferdinand grew, not as a boy, but as a wound that festered. Tutors tried to mold him. They gave him books in Latin and stories of chivalry. But Ferdinand learned only suspicion. Every eye seemed to mock, every word a veiled insult. He did not seek knowledge, he sought leverage. What he lacked in brilliance, he compensated for with cunning. He learned to mimic piety with frightening precision, reciting prayers with eyes hollow of belief. He kissed crucifixes with lips that would one day drip poison. As he approached adolescence, his gaze grew heavy. Servants whispered of how he stared too long, too hard, of how he lingered by the maids' quarters in the dead of night, breathing shallow in the shadows. No action, not yet, but the seed had taken root. A seed not of mere desire, but of dominion over flesh. The court physician once remarked that young Ferdinand's pulse quickened only in moments of cruelty. Not fear, not pleasure, but cruelty. A caged bird whose wings he plucked feather by feather. A hound beaten not out of anger, but curiosity. Small things dismissed. But in the annals of tyranny, great horrors often begin with tiny, overlooked acts. When he turned 15, the French Revolution shook Europe's crowns. Heads rolled in Paris, and monarchs elsewhere grew pale. But Ferdinand, he smiled. Revolution, to him, was not a threat. It was a lesson. That power was fleeting if not seized by the throat and strangled into submission. His father, slow and dull-witted, leaned more and more on Manuel Godoy, the prime minister, the queen's rumored lover and the true wielder of power. Ferdinand loathed him, not merely for his influence, but because Godoy embodied everything Ferdinand lacked: charisma, education, and the queen's whispered moans at night. Thus was born the boy's first true obsession: to destroy Godoy not through battle, but through rot. He began to weave his net of deceit. Letters to enemies, rumors among nobles, secret pacts with the clergy. He was still a prince, but already he moved like a spider, slow, silent, and venomous. And all the while, the boy who should have become a king became something else entirely. He watched the world like a butcher watches livestock, with the cold patience of one who knows that soon the knife will be his. Madrid, 1808. The city trembled beneath the boots of foreign soldiers. Napoleon's armies had poured across the Pyrenees like a steel tide, and in their wake came the erosion of a crumbling monarchy. Charles IV, weak-willed and weary, had abdicated, leaving the throne to his son, young, ambitious Ferdinand. But this was not a triumphant rise. It was a coronation built upon betrayal, manipulation, and whispered treason. Ferdinand had clawed his way to power, not through valor, but through conspiracy. He despised his father, loathed his mother's influence, and distrusted anyone who spoke of reform. In secret meetings, cloaked in incense and wine, he conspired with enemies of his own blood, forging pacts with French agents, trading trust for advantage. The people, hungry for a symbol of resistance, hailed him as a savior. They did not yet see the rot beneath the gold. In the palaces of El Escorial, the young king sat alone, staring into dark mirrors framed by skulls of former monarchs. He was fascinated with the image of himself in power, not the burdens of rule, but the theater of control. He rehearsed cruelty like a prayer. He practiced the curve of a frown, the weight of a command, the silence before punishment. Even his advisors, seasoned and cynical, began to whisper. They saw how Ferdinand's pleasures grew stranger, how he demanded young courtiers dress as saints while he, cloaked in papal robes, staged mock trials that ended in mock executions, or so it began. Later, some claimed the executions were no longer pretend. Spain, torn between the threat of French occupation and the decay of its own crown, had become a crucible of madness. Ferdinand, now a symbol of Spanish defiance, was paradoxically its greatest liability. In public, he paraded piety, kissed icons, wept at altars. In private, he indulged in grotesque rituals that blurred the line between sacrilege and insanity. Yet the people adored him, or so the state decreed. Censorship was swift, dissent silenced with shackles. Portraits of Ferdinand were placed in every church, his image sanctified. The myth had taken root, even as the man behind it sank deeper into a pit of paranoia, sadism, and lust. And behind palace doors, the servants began to vanish. It was 1813. Spain, torn and bleeding, had been freed from Napoleonic occupation, and Ferdinand VII once, the prisoner king, was restored to the throne. The people, weary of French boots and foreign tongues, hailed his return as the deliverance of a nation. They called him El Decido, the desired one. But what they desired and what he became were two different beasts. His arrival in Madrid was a theater of illusions. Banners fluttered, choirs sang, and thousands wept with joy. Yet behind the royal procession rode a man transformed by humiliation, vengeance, and years of captivity. The fetters of Napoleon had not only scarred his wrists, but had shattered whatever morality he once clung to. Within weeks, Ferdinand revealed his true face. The liberal constitution of 1812, forged in under the threat of French cannons, was abolished. He called it a disease, a French corruption of Spanish blood. He imprisoned those who had defended it, tortured those who still believed in it, and hunted its architects as heretics of the state. The ink of reform was replaced by the blood of dissenters. But this part of the tale is not merely about tyranny. Tyranny for Ferdinand was a canvas. His brush was cruelty, his palette, human souls. He was obsessed with control not only of a nation, but of bodies. Whispers emerged from the whispers of handmaidens dismissed in tears, of maids who vanished in silence, of girls brought to court for training. One servant, found sobbing in the kitchens, dared to say aloud what many only dared to dream in nightmares, that the king did not look at women, as a man looks at a woman, but as a butcher eyes meat. It is here, in the soft crimson halls of the palace, that we see the first shadows of Ferdinand's deeper depravity, where power bred possession and possession turned to perversion. What happened in the hidden wings of the royal court was not recorded in history books, but it was etched in the scars of its victims, in the nightmares of their families, and in the cold silence of vanished lives. The nation, meanwhile, clung to the memory of El Decido. They did not yet see that their savior had become a monster in a crown. And this, dear listener, is only the beginning of descent. The ancient stones of El Escorial Grey, silent. And looming had borne witness to centuries of royal secrets, but none so grotesque, so whisper-haunted, as those that unfolded under Ferdinand VII's reign. The monastery palace, that somber monolith built by Philip II to entomb kings and saints alike, had become a gilded tomb for morality itself. Within its echoing corridors, Ferdinand's appetites grew bolder, his vices less veiled. Courtiers, once loyal, now trembled not from reverence, but from the suffocating dread of being noticed by the king's wandering eye or his mercurial wrath. A glance could be a sentence, a misplaced word, a disappearance. It was here, beneath frescoed ceilings and behind crimson drapes, that the king hosted his most depraved indulgences. He did not see sin in what he did only divine right. His desires were cloaked in royal prerogative, and his heart, corrupted by paranoia, no longer distinguished pleasure from punishment. He brought in young maidens, daughters of nobles and peasants alike, under the guise of courtly elevation, nobly to discard them like puppets with severed strings. Some resisted, they screamed, some fled, and some were never seen again. Rumors bled like rot through the court. The queen herself, Maria Josepha Amalia, the young and pious Saxon princess, became a shadow in her own palace. Her hands trembled as she clutched her rosary beads. Whispering prayers in a tongue the king did not understand and no longer cared to tolerate. To him, she was a silent intruder into his theater of carnality. But even shadows have ears, and Ferdinand knew she prayed for his soul. He laughed. In the underground archives of El Escorial, hidden among decrees and forgotten chronicles, Ferdinand kept his personal ledger not of politics or warfare, but of conquests. Names, initials, moments. A diary of humiliation veiled in code, yet reeking of flesh and madness. It was as if he sought to record his descent into depravity, immortalizing each stain upon the fabric of monarchy. It was no longer a court. It was a theater of obsession, an empire of whispers, where virtue had been garroted and sanity confined to a locked chamber. And as the candles flickered low each night, the walls of El Escorial seemed to sigh, to remember, to weep. For in their silence they had heard the cries of the innocent, and they would never forget. In the cold stillness of the royal bedchamber, lined with velvet and regret, Ferdinand VII sat awake, his crown off, his robe undone, his breath sour with wine and bitterness. He was king of Spain, but in that moment he was a man defeated by a single cruel reality. His queen would not bleed. Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, barely 17 when wed to him, was the embodiment of chastity, beauty, and terror. Her eyes, wide and glassy, never met his. Her voice, like a fragile hymn, was seldom heard, but her silence was not submission. It was resistance. Every night, Ferdinand tried to claim what he believed was his royal right. And every night, the sheets bore no blood, and his pride twisted into fury. He blamed her. He blamed the priests who raised her. He blamed God for giving him a bride so devout that even the darkness of the bed could not uncoil her modesty. One evening, in a rage born of humiliation and impotence, he summoned the Archbishop of Toledo. The queen, he claimed, was bewitched, her purity unnatural, her virtue a veil for rebellion. The Archbishop, caught between throne and faith, could only murmur prayers and prescribe absurdities. Herbs, relics, the blessings of saints long dead. None of it worked. The court whispered, cruelly and often, that the king was cursed, that no woman, no matter how young or beautiful, could ever bear him a son or even endure his touch. The whispers grew into mockery, and mockery into rage. Desperate, Ferdinand turned not to physicians or priests, but to torturers of the soul-old women in hidden corners of Madrid, keepers of forgotten rituals and unspoken sins. They gave him powders, charms, oils that burned like fire and smelled like rot. Ply this beneath your tongue, one crone hissed, and she will open like a wound. But the queen did not. Instead, she withered. Her body grew frail, her eyes vacant. She ate little, spoke less, and on one rain-soaked morning a maid found her in the chapel, collapsed beneath the statue of the Virgin, clutching her rosary like a lifeline to a better world. She lived, but something within her had broken, perhaps forever. The king, of course, would not relent. In his mind, she was an enemy, now a traitor to his manhood, a conspirator with fate itself. His obsession with heirs grew darker, more erratic. He began to speak of annulments, of convents, of punishments too shameful for paper or pulpit. But Maria Josepha remained, silent, unbroken in spirit. And the fact that she survived enraged him more than if she had died. For in her refusal to be consumed, she had made him feel powerless. And Ferdinand VII could never forgive a woman who reminded him of his own failure. By the time the queen's health began to slip from ghostly silence into persistent illness, the palace itself had started to rot from within. Not in stone or wood, but in spirit. The court of Ferdinand VII had become a grotesque theaterine elaborate. Masquerade of nobility where the most dangerous performance was simply surviving. The king no longer ruled from reason, but from appetites. Ministers came and went like actors in a tragic play, each knowing that a single misstep or wrong word, an unamused glance could end in dismissal or disgrace. His council chambers smelled of wax, sweat, and decay. Flies buzzed even in winter. The once proud palace became known in whispers as La Corte de las Moscas, Court of Flies. And in the center of it all sat the king, bloated, bitter eyes, half-lidded with boredom or lust. He rarely spoke in full sentences. He gestured, he grunted. He barked orders like a butcher choosing his cuts. Foreign dignitaries returned to their countries bearing tales not of Spain's strength, but of its monarch's sickness. Ferdinand had developed a fascination, no, an obsession with theatrical punishment. He turned the court into a stage of humiliation. Nobles were forced to grovel at his feet. Courtiers were made to crawl across marble floors for his amusement. One bishop, who dared question the king's interpretation of divine right, was ordered to kiss the hem of Ferdinand's nightshirt while it was still damp with sweat from his royal bed. Even the jesters feared him. For in Ferdinand's kingdom, comedy could turn to cruelty with the flick of a scepter. But the most chilling act was one rarely seen by outsiders: the Chamber of Shadows. It was said to be a private salon deep within that, lit only by candlelight and heavy with the scent of burning incense and iron. It was here that Ferdinand hosted his most depraved entertainments. Women, some from the lowest slums of Madrid, others whispered to be noble daughters held against their will, were paraded before him in rituals masquerading as theater. They were made to act out scenes of betrayal, of penance, of royal punishment. Sometimes the roles reversed servants pretending to be queens, queens degraded as servants. Ferdinand watched it all with the detachment of a man no longer tethered to reality. He laughed where others would scream. He applauded where others would avert their eyes. No one dared protest. Not the priests, not the ministers, not the people. For Spain had bled too much in his name. Its fields were fallow. Its coffers were hollow. And its people, beaten into silence by decades of war and repression, had learned that kings could be monsters and monsters could wear crowns. Yet even in this darkness, the world turned. And within the broken shell of the monarchy, something stirred. Whispers of succession, rumors of rebellion. The old families, once cowed into submission, began to murmur again behind silk curtains and candle smoke. But Ferdinand, Ferdinand only smiled. He believed himself untouchable. After all, who could dethrone a man who had already cast out his soul? In the final years of Ferdinand VII's life, the kingdom held its breath not in awe, but in dread. Spain, battered by wars, bled dry by taxes, and suffocating beneath the weight of its king's madness, no longer prayed for salvation. It prayed for release, and then ... came her. Maria Christina of the two Sicilies, his fourth queen, pale, young, dutiful, and as silent as the marble statues lining the royal palace. She was not a woman of fire like his first, not a shadowy companion like his second, and not a quiet slave like the third. No, Maria Christina was something else entirely, a vessel. Ferdinand did not choose her for companionship, nor for beauty. He chose her for her bloodline, for her womb, for her ability to deliver the one thing he could not die without, an heir. But fate, ever cruel in the House of Bourbon, had one final irony prepared. On a warm September evening in 1830, the bells of Madrid rang not in mourning, but in birth. A child had been born, a girl, Isabella, a daughter, not a son. And with her first breath, Spain plunged into a new kind of chaos. Ferdinand's face, it is said, turned ashen when he was told. Yet he did not scream, nor rage, nor weep. He simply stared at the child, then at the trembling midwife, and whispered, "Then let the law burn." For you see, the law Salic law forbade women from inheriting the throne of Spain. It was a shield forged in old steel, meant to protect the line from fragmentation. But Ferdinand, ever the tyrant, even in fatherhood, did what tyrants do best. He broke it. The pragmatic sanction, signed by his trembling hand, cast aside centuries of tradition. Isabella would be queen, he decreed. Let no man, not even blood, challenge her claim. But blood always speaks. Carlos, Ferdinand's younger brother, a stern and pious man with his own ambitions, saw in Isabella's birth not a miracle, but a theft. In his eyes, the throne was his by divine right, and a girl, no matter how royal her blood, was an insult to God and country. Thus, as Ferdinand's body decayed in silk-lined rooms, Spain was torn between two futures, one draped in the lace of a child queen, the other armed in the iron will of her uncle. The tension twisted the palace like a fever. Courtiers picked sides. Bishops plotted. Generals sharpened swords, not for foreign wars, but for brothers' throats. Madrid was no longer a city of marble. It was a crucible of betrayal. And Ferdinand, he simply watched. His body had begun to betray him. Gout had twisted his joints into cruel shapes. His tongue was swollen, his teeth blackened, and his breath stank of wine, milk, and rotting meat. He rarely left his chambers. When he did, he was carried like a corpse, awaiting burial through halls that echoed with whispers of the end. But he still ruled. Even when the flesh failed, the will endured. He summoned Carlos. They dined in silence. No one knows what was said, only that Carlos left pale and rigid, and Ferdinand returned to his bed with a smirk. In that final month, Ferdinand's nights were filled with dreams or nightmares. Servants claimed they heard him scream in the dark, clawing at the air, calling out names long dead. Wives, mothers, lovers, once they found him weeping beside a burning candle, murmuring to a portrait of Isabella, "I have bought you a crown, but it will cost you your soul." On the 29th of September, 1833, the king who had once made nations tremble died not in glory or reverence, but in bloated silence. Spain, however, did not breathe easy. It held its breath once more for a new war, a new tyrant, a new wound. Ferdinand was gone, Tea was gone, but his shadow had only just begun to fall. They say the dead rest in silence, but Ferdinand VII was no ordinary dead man. When his breath ceased, the world did not turn the page. It paused, trembled on, then ignited. His body, bloated and discolored, was dressed in royal regalia and laid upon a catafalque within the palace of El Escorial. Priests muttered hollow prayers, while noblemen bowed, not in grief, but in calculation. The corpse still wore a crown gold, crusted with sweat and salt, resting on a brow that once demanded kneeling. But that crown no longer symbolized power. It was a curse. Spain erupted before the king's body had even cooled. The Carlist Wars named for his brother. Don Carlos swept the land in a storm of fire and betrayal. Towns were razed, families torn apart, and churches became battlegrounds between faith and dynasty. Carlos claimed divine right. Isabella claimed legal truth. The people chose sides, but no side found peace. And at the center of it all, rotting beneath marble and incense, was the architect of their doom. Ferdinand VII. In the shadows of history, the whispers never ceased. Some said he had orchestrated the war as his final act of vengeance. Others claimed he had cursed the crown before he died, sealing Spain in eternal discord. But perhaps the cruelest truth was simpler. Ferdinand did not destroy Spain out of hatred. He did it out of love, a twisted, devouring love for power, for blood, for legacy. He could not bear a world where his name faded, where his choices dissolved into dust. So he ensured that every breath taken after his death would carry the weight of his memory. He lived in the war cries, in the shattered towns, in the weeping of mothers who lost sons for a throne not their own, and in Isabella young, fragile, forced to wear a crown forged in poison, he lived still. They called her queen, but she was never free, or every step haunted by her father's ghost, every decision judged by his legacy. She would grow, reign, and die under a sky Ferdinand blackened long before her birth. In time, statues would be built. Streets named Storians would debate his policies, his wars, his women. But none could deny this. Ferdinand VII was not just a king. He was a curse. A sovereign whose touch rotted all it graced. A man who turned a kingdom into a mausoleum. A monarch who, in seeking immortality, damned his bloodline, his country, and his soul. And so we leave him not in glory, nor in vilification, but in shadow. A cold, unending shadow cast not by fate, but by choice. The most perverted king in history. No, something worse. The king who never let go.